Hurricane Lee is poised to become a major hurricane as it makes its way westward across the Atlantic. I'm meteorologist Joe Martucci, joined with me as always, Sean Sublette. Sean, what are you thinking here as we wrap up the week and get into, well, the exact peak of hurricane season, which is September 10th?
Yeah, we've got just about everybody looking at Hurricane Lee, and this is something that's going to be out there for several more days. You hear the noise kind of ratcheting up about it. That's only going to build through the weekend and into early next week. So, as the expression goes, all eyes are on Hurricane Lee.
Yes, all eyes on Hurricane Lee. And for us, being part of the Lee weather team, this takes a
Hmm.
little maybe more significance to
Yeah.
us here. It's always interesting when your name is involved with a hurricane. But this is what we'll talk about here today. Hurricane Lee continuing to strengthen. We'll talk about how you really don't have to worry about anything this week, even into the weekend, if you're on the
Hmm.
east coast of the US. Then, as we go into next week, that's when we start to think about, hey, what could this mean for us? Whether you're
Yeah.
in South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, New Jersey, Florida, whatever have you. We'll talk a little bit about that. So, Sean,
Mhm.
take us to where we are on our Thursday morning with Lee.
Yeah, so this is the early morning advisory from the National Hurricane Center. The top winds, maximum sustained wind, so that 2 minute average wind speed, 80 miles an hour. And you watch the last couple of frames of that loop, you really start to see the eye show up. Everything indicating that this storm is strengthening and will continue to strengthen for the foreseeable future, the next 2 or 3 days or so. I suspect that by the time we get to this evening, or certainly first thing on Friday morning, we've got a category 2 or 3 storm to contend with. And indeed, that's kind of what the Hurricane Center is discussing as they look through their 5 day forecast. Now, to reiterate what we said at the outset, if you've got plans for this weekend at the beach, you're fine. Even Monday morning, this thing is still hanging northward from Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and eastward from the Bahamas. But by then, it is expected to be a very dominant category 4 storm. After that is when things start to get a little wishy washy. At some point, it is going to start to turn to the north. Where that turn happens early next week will go a long way in determining the ultimate position of this thing toward the end of next week. So, Joe, we talk a lot about category 2s, 3s, 4s, and the Saffir Simpson scale. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, and it's all about the wind. The Saffir Simpson scale goes from category 1 to category 5 when it comes to hurricanes here, and it's based on the wind speed. So let's talk about category 1 hurricane. Maximum sustained wind somewhere in the storm between 74 to 95 miles an hour. And typically we see 3 to 4 feet of storm surge with this. So, we can get this with some nor'easters sometimes. So it's
Mhm.
something that if you're on the East Coast, if you're in the Mid Atlantic or Northeast, you get your nor'easters. South Carolina, Georgia, still 3 to 4 feet of surge is something we've seen. When you get to a category 2 hurricane, winds go up, even can be over 100 miles an hour sustained, 5 to 8 feet of storm surge. That's when you start to get noticeable roof and siding damage here, power outages that can last for days. Then we get to category 3, which starts our major hurricanes. That means maximum sustained winds of at least 111 miles an hour. This is when you're talking about significant impacts on land here if you're along the beaches, and it just goes up from there. We call it category 4 extreme because the damage is extreme with this. 131 to 155 maximum sustained winds, 13, 18 feet of storm surge sometimes with this. I mean, this is going to be flooding blocks inland. And then we get to the rare category 5 hurricanes. Usually, if we see something category 5, it's in the middle of the open Atlantic. Very rarely does it make landfall as a category 5, but if and when it does, that is when there's tremendous, tremendous devastation. I mean, you can go on and on about what you're talking about here in terms of the amount of damage and the power loss and the water and the rain and everything from this. Now, we don't expect this to be a category 5 hurricane according to the latest National Hurricane Center models, but we'll keep an eye for it here. And we're also keeping an eye again on these ensemble tracks, which Sean, you're going to point out for us.
Yeah, so many times you'll hear about these things called ensembles or spaghetti plots. And well, which one of these models are right? We don't know if any of them are right. But what they do is they give us an idea of where the thing might go. you take a whole bunch of different simulations and see if they converge to the same idea to give you some confidence on where the thing is going to go. And that's what we see here in the next 6 days. We alluded to this before. The thing is going to make a turn to the north about 5 or 6 days from now. We see that in the ensembles. Then after that, it's still an open question as to, does it hook farther out to sea? Does it continue further to the north? Or does this kind of go slightly west to due north, where we have to be much more concerned about the immediate Atlantic coast? So there is still a lot to be written about this storm. But if you are heading to the beach this weekend or the shore this weekend, the biggest impacts are likely going to be building seas, high surf, rip currents, that kind of thing. So that's the thing to be most mindful of if you are going to the beach or the shore this weekend. Now, Joe, if we like to extrapolate further and we think about how big the wind field is going to be as this thing moves north, take us through that on this particular simulation. Here we've incorporated what's called the GFS, but this reminder, this is not the end all be all.
Yeah, so the GFS model is our American model here that can go way out, 16 days in the future. And if you watch Snow Search with us during the winter, we've used this as well. So this is the wind field. Now, where you see the yellows, this is about tropical storm force. Where you see the purples pop up, that's going to be about hurricane force. So this is today on Thursday. Now we're going to walk you through this as we go into the weekend here. It's already pretty wide. I mean, you already get some wind anywhere from Bermuda down to the U.S. Virgin Islands here. It's not strong winds there, but at least some winds from this storm. Then as we go into next week, again, this is one computer model run, but the wind field is very large here. And, if you take this GFS model and you say, hey, this is going to be it. Well, you're talking about the center of the storm, about maybe 150, 200 miles west-northwest of Bermuda. If you're on the Outer Banks, you're getting 20-mile-an-hour sustained winds from this, and the wind field is large. But you take a shift 100 miles west, you got tropical storm force conditions in the Outer Banks, and maybe even places like Norfolk as well. Again, 100 miles to the east. We're not talking about anything here on the East Coast. But, like Sean said, more than likely, we are going to not see a direct hit in the U.S. East Coast with this. That being said, rip currents, high surf, maybe even a little bit of coastal flooding as well, because we do have the new moon next week, too. That's going to elevate our tides. That's all in the realm of possibility. Remember what we just had with Idalia and Franklin 2 weeks ago here, where it was a lot of bad shore impacts, but it wasn't a bad day to be at the beach. But being in the water was the issue. That kind of same story is probably the most likely scenario, but we're going to refine this as we go into the next couple of days. And we're going to do another hurricane hunt for you on Friday here, just to take you into the weekend and what our thoughts are.
Yeah, absolutely. As we like to remind people, the cone is not the end all be all. The cone is important. It's like the cover of a book, but you've got to go inside of that book to look at the impacts. So just because, I'm outside the cone, I'm okay. That is not necessarily the case. So to take it on home, remember, Hurricane Lee continues to strengthen. That will be the case for at least another couple of days. No threat this weekend to the East Coast, but there will be high surf and rip currents. And the position later next week will still need refining. Right now, we like better than 50-50 odds. It doesn't have a direct impact on the Northeast coast or anywhere on the East Coast, but that's not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination. So you don't have to panic about it. Just keep following along with us to see where this thing ends up next week.
Yeah, totally. So for this episode of Hurricane Hunt, we got Sean Sublette in Richmond, Virginia. I'm Joe Martucci here at the Jersey Shore. We will be back with you on Friday here for another edition of Hurricane Hunt.